2.3, equilibrium. This is a word I think some of you may have heard before. I know a lot of people say they hear it in science, and you can kind of see this root of like equal. And what we're going to see that is that exactly what it is in economics. It's this balancing point. And so today, as we look at equilibrium, what we want to do is be able to define and solve for equilibrium using our supply and demand graphs. We also want to explain the significance of equilibrium as it relates to economics and relates to market prices. We're going to define surplus and shortages, identifying both, and finally differentiating between price floors and price ceilings, describing how both of those price controls impact markets. So let's start off taking what we talked about with 2.1 and our demand curve, that line showing us the quantity demanded at every single price. We had our demand schedule, it looked something like this, and if we take those points, plotted them out, we'd have a curve that looked like that. So that's our demand curve. We see this law of demand in action, the idea that as prices go down, quantity demanded goes up. As prices go up, quantity demanded goes down. We also, though, in 2.2 had our supply curve. Our supply curve was that line showing us the quantity supplied at every single price. So again, we had a schedule. We look at our schedule, we see this law of supply in action, the idea that as the price goes down, the quantity supplied is also going down. We plot those points out, and we get an X that looks like this. What we notice about this graph is something very unique, is that it intersects, and it intersects at one specific point. And that point is very important because that point right there is where we see that the quantity supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. And we call that our equilibrium. This is the point, I kind of like to refer to it as like a happy point, because everyone who is demanding gas at that price is getting the gas, and there's no gas left over afterward. That's why it's our equilibrium. It's where things are equal. So again, equilibrium, just kind of a textbook definition, is this balancing point in the economy, wherever we see that the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. And again, for us, if we were to look at our schedules side by side, we notice that at 225, 40 gallons of gas, 40 million, I should say, 40 million gallons of gas are being demanded, and 40 million gallons of gas are being supplied. And so we look at that on our curve. What we notice is our curves intersect, right? At 225, our two curves intersect one another, 40 million gallons of gas. That is our equilibrium. It's this price, our equilibrium price, wherever we see that the quantities match up, where the amount that consumers are willing to buy is exactly equal to the amount that sellers are willing to produce. But what we see is that over time, these actions of buyers and sellers naturally move us to this equilibrium. We see that if prices go too high and we have too much of something, prices are going to drop. If we see we have too little of something and prices are too low, prices are going to rise. And we eventually balance out at this equilibrium price. And that's how prices are set within our economy. Within a free market economy, prices are set by buyers and sellers interacting with one another and taking price signals from one another in order to understand where do we need to settle in at a price within this market. Now, what we had mentioned is that at that point of 225, the amount that people wanted was equal. But what happens when it's not equal? Well, let's look at a point like $1.75. Whenever gas is $1.75, what we notice is that the amount that's being demanded, 60 million gallons, is much larger than the amount that's being supplied, 20 million. So if we go to our graph and we line this up, what we notice is that we intersect our supply curve there at 20 million, we intersect our demand curve there at 60 million. But what that does is it causes this big old gap, and we see that gap represented as that distance between those 2 points. That gap right there is a shortage. And it's called a shortage because we have more that's being demanded than is being supplied. And so we're short a certain number of gallons of gas. Like we see that there's people who want to buy gas, but there's not enough available for them. And this is because the price is too low. When that price falls below equilibrium, more people want to buy it, but fewer suppliers want to sell it. And therefore, whenever our price is below our equilibrium price, that quantity demanded is going to be greater than the quantity supplied. And because of that, we're going to see that we have a shortage. Now, if we were to look at this and say, what is the size of our shortage? Well, what you would want to do is look there at $1.75 and say, okay, how many gallons of gas do we come up short? Well, 60 million gallons of gas were being demanded, and only 20 million gallons of gas were able to be purchased. That means we have a shortage there of 40 million gallons of gas. And again, it's a shortage because our quantity demanded is greater than our quantity supplied. But what happens when our price is maybe too high? Maybe gas is set up there at a price of $2.50 a gallon. So this is above our equilibrium. If we go up here again and we look at where this price intersects our curves, we see that at a price of 250, we intersect our demand curve at 30 million gallons. We intersect our supply curve at 50 million gallons. But what that does again is gives us a gap between our two lines. That gap is that distance between those two gray circles. And what we do is we look at that and say, all right, what's going on here? What's the problem within our economy? Well, the problem is that we have a surplus. A surplus is when we see that more is being made available than is being demanded at a specific price. In this case, at a price of $2.50, more gas is being made available by suppliers than what people want to buy. Because our quantity supplied is greater than our quantity demanded, we have a surplus. That surplus is that gap right there. Now, how big is our surplus in this case? Well, we see that our surplus is the difference between 50 million and 30 million, because 50 million gallons were being supplied, but only 30 million of those gallons were purchased. Therefore, we have a surplus or leftover of 20 million gallons of gas. Another thing I want us to look at with this as well is what would happen with our economy when we do have a surplus. Well, what happens whenever a business has too much of something? Well, they put on a sale. They lower the price of it. And the reason they lower the price is because they want to get us back close to an equilibrium or get us to a point where the amount that people want is equal to how much they still have left in stock. Sometimes we see that the government actually steps in certain scenarios and forces a surplus or forces a shortage. Now, why would they do that? Well, there's very good reasons for it, but let's talk about a few of those instances. I want us to first look at the supply and demand for Uber. So again, people who wanted to get a ride from a ride-sharing company like Uber, we see that there have been instances where the government has stepped in. Specifically, there was a Forbes article that was put out a couple years ago about how in India there was a restriction put on the price or how much that drivers for Uber were able to charge customers during a certain time. There's like this surge period at night whenever tons and tons of people wanted to get rides and therefore they would jack up the price during that time. The government stepped in and said, we don't think that's fair. So let's talk a little bit about why we don't think that's fair. Well, the government said that's way too high, the equilibrium price, so therefore we're going to set a maximum price within the market. This maximum is known as a price ceiling. In the same way that the ceiling of the room that you're in right now is the maximum within that room, a price ceiling is a maximum price that you're able to sell for. So if our equilibrium price, say for a ride was $25 and there's 1,000 people that are hailing rides that night, what we see is that when the government stepped in with this price ceiling, they said, no, you're not allowed to charge, say, more than $15 for one of those rides. Well, two things actually happen at once whenever we see the government implement that maximum. Now, again, this is a ceiling because it's a top limit. It keeps us from going up to our equilibrium. It says you can't go above $15, therefore it keeps us away from our $25 equilibrium price. But we see two things happen at once. First of all, since that price is lower, more people want to take an Uber. There might be people who say, hey, before at $25, it wasn't worth it. But now at $15, yeah, I'm willing to go ahead and call an Uber. But at the same time, we see that the supply of Ubers or the supply of drivers is going to decrease because there's drivers who say, hey, it's not worth my time for $15 to go out and give people rides. It was at 25, but not at 15. And so what this does is it actually prevents us from getting up to that equilibrium price, which creates a shortage. That distance along that green line between our supply curve and our demand curve is a shortage. It's saying that, hey, when we lower that price and force that price to stay lower, what we see is that the amount that's demanded is going to be much larger than the amount that's being supplied. And an effective price ceiling is set below our equilibrium price, and this is because it would keep us from rising up to our equilibrium. It wouldn't be effective if the government set a maximum price at, say, like $1,000 for a ride. Well, yeah, that's never going to happen. That's not ever going to be the top limit, and therefore it's not a concern. But an effective price ceiling, one that is actually restrictive on our market, is one that is set below our equilibrium. Sometimes we see that they, instead of setting a maximum, they set a minimum. This is sometimes known as a price floor, just in the same way that the floor that you are currently sitting on or in the room that you're in is a minimum within the room. A price floor in our economy is a minimum price. Now, one of those minimum prices you might be aware of is minimum wage. Minimum wage actually keeps us away from our equilibrium for labor. So let's take a look at this graph and say that this is the supply and demand for labor. It's the supply and demand for the amount of workers or work that is being demanded by businesses versus what's being supplied by individuals in this resource market transaction. So the government steps in and says $7.25, that's our minimum wage. You are not allowed to charge less than $7.25 an hour for your work. Well, again, this is a price floor. It's creating us from going down to our equilibrium. And so this creates a surplus. We see that a surplus of labor is actually referred to as unemployment, right? And an effective price floor is set at a price above our equilibrium price. And it's set above because it's effective that way. It keeps us from going down to our equilibrium. A minimum wage of $1 wouldn't be effective at all within our economy. Well, why not? Because nobody is sitting there wishing that they could sell their labor for $1 an hour, right? The equilibrium is going to be much higher than that. And therefore, we see that in order for it to be a restrictive price control, it needs to be set above our equilibrium. And so this is a little backwards. I know sometimes you think, hey, a floor is below, a ceiling's above. Within economics, we actually see price floors and price ceilings are switched. A price ceiling is falling below our equilibrium. A price floor is above